Good morning, everyone. As Spencer says, I'm Matt Payton. I'm Chief Executive of Radiocentre, the industry body for commercial radio in the UK, a role I was privileged and delighted to take up in July this year. That doesn't sound like very long, I know, but I have been at Radiocentre a while, and we've had 3 Prime Ministers and 4 Chancellors in that time, so I feel like a bit of a veteran anyway. Okay. As I say, we're a commercial radio body in the UK. We represent broadcasters of all shapes and sizes, from the large national networks to the small, local and independent operators, everyone from global to boom radio, both of whom I understand you'll be hearing from at some point later today. And as the industry body, our role and remit, I think, is very clear. Essentially, it's to make the case as powerfully as we can for advertisers to invest in radio and audio, and to communicate radio's key role at the heart of the evolving audio world, and also to help shape and influence regulation so that radio can continue to grow. And my challenge in my new job is to make sure that we're doing all we can to deliver on that remit, especially given some of the big changes that are happening in our industry with the expansion of digital content distribution and advertising. And so today I want to talk a little bit about some of the exciting changes that are happening from a UK perspective, some of which my colleagues have already touched on already, and how they've been driving what some in the media have called a sonic boom in radio and audio. In particular, I'd like to highlight the growth of digital services and how these have helped bolster the commercial radio audience, the evidence of radio's enduring value for audiences and for advertisers, and as well as some of the threats that we see on the horizon that we think need to be tackled in order to secure radio's valuable role into the future. And before I do that, it's just worth probably stepping back and taking a moment to consider the market context for radio and audio in the UK, not only in terms of the usual ups and downs in revenue and audience, but also the underlying changes that we're seeing in listening habits, distribution and in technology. And I'm sure I don't need to labour the point to this audience, but just look at how the audio market has changed in the last few years. Whether that's with the launch and the rapid adoption of smart speakers, the emergence of connected cars, or the expansion of audio content with new radio stations and the growth of podcasting. These innovations, we think, make it a really exciting time to be in the radio and audio business, probably the most exciting and innovative time there's ever been. And radio is absolutely at the forefront of this, with stations evolving and investing both in broadcast and in digital products, building audiences and relationships in ways that were probably inconceivable just a few short years ago. And these changes in technology have undoubtedly worked in radio's favour so far, making it even more accessible and available to audiences, however and wherever they're listening. So it should come as no surprise that radio also represents the biggest share of listening to all commercial audio overall. That's audio content where ads can be served. So this data is from the industry standard Radar Midas survey in the UK, which shows that live radio's listening share of the commercial audio market is an incredible 80% or so, 78%. What's more, the size of the commercial audio market overall is increasing, so the cake is growing and providing more opportunities for everybody. And that's really encouraging, as it demonstrates that radio can work alongside podcasts and on-demand audio, expanding choice for audiences and advertisers. And it shows it doesn't need to be a zero-sum game between live radio on the one hand and on-demand audio on the other hand. Both can grow and they can thrive together, and that's a really important point for us to take on board as the industry body and to reflect. But radio's success in recent years, as has been mentioned, is also a result of investment in new services and the expansion of choice. And just to take one example, which Patrick and Shuja have both touched on, after many years of investment, the growth of brand extensions and new stations on DAB and online now provides the opportunity for stations of all sizes to extend their offering and to build audiences around specific eras, genres and passions. And that's most obviously true with the example of the Absolute Radio Decade stations, like Absolute 80s and 90s and so on, or a station like Capital Dance or Smooth Chill. But you also see it with digital-only services like Virgin Radio, Planet Rock, or Boom Radio, who've been able to build successful services without an FM frequency in a way that wasn't possible just a few years ago. And what's fascinating to consider is how this has actually helped support the overall growth in the commercial radio audience overall. As you can see from this chart, the total size, the total reach of commercial radio in the UK has grown 15% over the last 10 years and now reaches a record 38 million people each week. And as I said, there's lots of factors that will contribute to that success, but there's no doubt the expansion of choice and the growing popularity of digital services has been a major factor in this. And so why do I say that? Well, if you look at the total hours spent listening to commercial radio over that period, you can see that's also grown up 17% in the last 10 years, which really, if you think about it, during that period of an explosion of other entertainment options and media choices, is a pretty incredible performance. But the true impact of digital services as part of this is only really evident when you split that out, as we do here. And what this shows is that the total listening for most traditional FM and DAB simulcast stations, which is the pink block here, now that's been pretty resilient, but it hasn't grown significantly. Yet the sort of digital-only stations that I was talking about a moment ago, here in the blue, have been really successful in adding listening time to commercial radio, especially in the last couple of years. In fact, the blue line, the digital-only services, have more than doubled in terms of time spent listening over that period, in terms of hours, and now represent 17% of all commercial radio listening hours, and that trend is only going one way. And building on these investments in digital radio services in the UK, we're also starting to see a significant expansion from commercial radio groups in their own podcasts and online audio content. The Newsagents podcast from Global's a really good recent example of this, where they brought in high-profile presenting talent from the BBC in the form of Emily Maitlis, John Sopel, and Lewis Goodall, to provide a really compelling and informative daily news podcast. And frankly, what a time to launch in the UK with all the drama around British politics in the last few months. And as a result, it's topped the podcast charts, and it's been the most successful new commercial radio podcast launch to date. And all this is great news for audiences and for advertisers, but it also highlights the public service contribution of radio and audio, which has been touched on as well. And there's tons of evidence about radio's power as a force for good for audiences and its trusted role. And that can be anything from providing companionship to the power and impact of radio news, all of which has really come to the fore in the last few years, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we know from our own research that radio remains the most trusted source of news across all audience groups in the UK. Almost 8 out of 10 saying they trust radio, with TV not far behind, and social media the least trusted. And as Patrick has mentioned already, of course, trust in radio isn't just specific to the UK. There's consistent evidence that shows radio is the most trusted medium across Europe, with radio, the dark blue on this map, coming out top in the vast majority of European countries surveyed by the European Commission. And as the voice of commercial radio, we're always keen to highlight this public service role and this trusted role, especially to government and to regulators. Alongside this, we also point to radio's positive economic impact, both directly and indirectly for advertisers. But the truth is, there's also clouds on the horizon, and we need changes to the regulation and the legal framework if radio is going to continue to thrive. Specifically, we believe radio and audiences in the UK would be better served by changes in two main areas. Firstly, we think there should be tighter regulation around BBC radio services, and secondly, ensuring all radio remains freely accessible and available to everyone, especially online. Just very briefly on the BBC, we know it plays a very important and valuable role in the radio and audio market, and we generally have really good, positive relationships and partnerships with the BBC. But it is by far the biggest single operator in UK radio, and this role comes with responsibility to provide truly distinctive services, and we believe more could and should be done in that area. And it's really important we get that right, because we think the future of radio, and on the issue of the future of radio, we've got a lot of issues in common with the BBC where we can be working together. For example, on the access, findability of radio, this has become a really pressing issue for all of us, especially as online listening and radio becomes greater and more established on smart speakers, now accounting for an incredible 73% of audio listening on these devices in the UK. Of course, it's true to say, and it's been touched on already, most radio is, of course, still listened over broadcast, and that's likely to continue mainly on FM and DAB. And there's many benefits to that. But consumer habits are changing, and we can't ignore that. In the past 4 years, online listening in the UK to live radio has more than doubled and now represents 24% of listening time, with smart speakers accounting for the majority of listening on connected devices. And this growth, it creates some fantastic opportunities for all of us, particularly commercial players, but it also throws up some big challenges. That's because of the gatekeeper role played by Amazon, Google, and the other platforms that puts them in an incredibly powerful and potentially dominant position right between radio and its audiences. And that dominance creates real risks for the future, especially if there's no ground rules on how radio content is offered, accessed, and commercialized. As a result, we think it's vital that government brings forward measures to secure radio's position online, something we think actually that can be done pretty simply and effectively in a way that's ultimately a win-win for radio, for audiences, and the platforms themselves. So to summarize, radio's in a really strong place due to that combination of what I was talking about in terms of smart investment in content, distribution, and talent. Digital services have been clearly a really important part of this journey, supporting listening hours and supporting revenue. And the audio market is continuing to evolve to offer exciting opportunities for growth. However, we think there's clouds on the horizon and action is going to be required to sustain this success into the future. Our government and regulator needs to ensure BBC regulations fit for purpose and applied properly, and we urgently need new legislation to support access, findability, and the prominence of radio online and on smart speakers. If we get this right, radio and audio will be stronger. It'll be able to deliver even greater economic and public value, and listeners will continue to get the choice and diversity of content that they love. Thank you very much for listening.